Alright, so I wanted to make a video about what I perceive to be the current state of, I guess, what some people call the culture war, but I'm going to have a different take on it than you might have heard before because I think I've said on this channel before that usually once you define the terms of a question or a contradiction, the contradiction will often resolve or synthesize into a higher form that encompasses both contradictory avenues. So I think what we have in the culture war, which I regard the Russia-Ukraine conflict as part of, which I regard COVID as part of, which I regard transgenderism, feminism, critical race theory, all the identity grievance stuff as a part of, which I regard the Trump indictment as a part of. What I see fundamentally in all these disparate things is a confusion that it's a false contradiction between what I would consider an Eastern model of the world and a Western model of the world, and I guess it would be a tripartite struggle between the sort of anarchical or chaotic part of the world. And the problem I see, there's a problem with the East, the West, and the anarchy. And the problem with the West, I'm going to go into each of these in more detail, but basically the problem with the West is this sort of like Judeo-Christian monotheism. And I'll go into why that's a problem later. The problem with the East is atheism and secularism, and the problem with the anarchy is that anarchy is dysfunctional, and it's based on a myth that doesn't actually exist. So it's a dysfunctional myth as opposed to a functional myth or a partially functional myth, because when I'm looking at a myth, I'm not judging the myth based on its historicity. I'm judging the myth based on its pragmatic value. And all myths are historically false, but some myths are very useful, and some myths are not. So, and some myths, they get the job done for a while, but you have to change them, modify them, understand them. And to do that requires you to go outside of the myth, which is what we're seeing in the West right now. People are going outside of the myth, which I think is a good thing, but there are some problems with how it's happening, and I want to address those problems just so you can say I warned you. So the problem with the Western world as such, and by that I mean pretty much the United States, some parts of South America, Canada, Western Europe for the most part, some parts of Eastern Europe. That's basically it. And Japan. Is that the Western world is sort of largely stuck in this Christian mindset. And the problem with the Christian mindset is that, one, it's very binary. Monotheism is very simple. It's very dualistic morally. It's very, as I said in one of my previous videos, most things are not, most things are non-binary. Very, ironically, the only thing that really is binary are it's electricity or polarity and gender. Those are the two things that are actually binary. So everything else is pretty much multiplicitous. And that's not to say it has no structure, but the structure of a multiplicitous thing is not anarchical, it's not infinite. It's just multiplicitous. It has many parts. And the problem with the Western model of the world is that it's very binary. It's culturally binary. So we're very quick to demonize people, to make people into the adversary of Satan or Set or Saturn. And we are very light-focused people. And I don't mean that necessarily in a good way. The Western world is effectively following the model of Christ, and the model of Christ is a solar and Jupiterian entity. So he is effectively a half of the Great Father. He's the light half of the Great Father. In sort of polytheistic pagan symbolism, I hate the word pagan, but in polytheistic symbolism, one of the core features is soul, is sun. And sun has two opposite symbols, you could say. One of them is the sort of feminine moon, which is in some ways seen as a sister, but it's still an opposite in that the sun and the moon are different genders. But in almost every, like, you don't think father moon and mother sun, you think father sun and mother moon. There's a reason for that. It's because masculinity is viewed with, is always associated with fire, with heat, with air, with like dryness, and those are all qualities of the sun. And the moon is the opposite, wetness, sort of receptivity and that kind of thing. That would be the female, and that would be the moon. This being said, the sun has another opposite, and the sun's opposite is Saturn in these symbolic systems. In fact, the symbol of the sun is a circle with a dot in the middle, and it's often said that the circle that surrounds the dot is Saturn. The rings, these circles, these things are often associated with binding, with separation, with removal of unwanted material, with waste removal, trash cleanup, what have you. And so when you embrace the opposite of all of that, all of those Saturnian values of getting rid of unwanted things, what you end up with is pretty obvious. You end up with inclusivity, you end up with tolerance, you end up with these solar Jupiterian values of wanting to be a father to the world, with wanting to embrace everything, to bring democracy everywhere. And this is my beef with Jesus as a symbol, right? When you combine Sun and Jupiter, you get a very powerful energy. But you get a powerful energy that has a good and a bad side. Every symbol has a good and a bad side. Every symbol has positive and negative elements within it. It could be a fundamentally positive symbol. Sun and Jupiter are positive symbols, in the way that, an electricity outlet is a source of positivity. But if you stick a fork in an electricity outlet, you will find very quickly that positive doesn't always mean good. And that is what the symbol of Jesus fails to take into account. Because it's like you've got this very powerful energy that's like crackling behind the scenes. And nobody seems to realize that these symbols that you're using, like the Jesus with his hand over his heart, the heart is a solar center, the heart is a solar symbol. He's always got solar halos around his head. He's always associated with light and fire. and spirit, all of these solar things and Jupiterian things, people don't realize that the dark side of Jupiter has always been gluttony, willful blindness, excessive indulgence of things, hedonism, overconsumption, and this sort of, he's too tolerant, he is decadent. And when you look at all of the East, which are the sort of Saturnian nations, they have strong borders, they have strong boundaries between things. They, are interested in keeping their populations strong, removing things that could be seen as more negative. Let me turn these lights back on real quick. There we go. So they're very selective. They aren't tolerant. They aren't inclusive. They're dogmatic, and they claim to be atheistic. But I always joke with my friends that if Saturn was Saturn was a person, he would be an atheist, because Saturn is all about the material world. It's about what you can see. It's about trial and error, cause and effect, evidence-based stuff. It's very dry. It is a sort of an androgynous entity, an androgynous element, and as such, it's ruled over by air and earth, which are the material world, and analytics, logic, that kind of thing. So it has all of these sort of hard secular values, but it doesn't have any of the tolerance and whatnot. So when you put these two things together, you've got two entities, two groups, two cultures, right? You've got the Jupiterian Western culture, which doesn't know it's decadent because it's embraced Jesus, who is perfect, but is also an avatar or an emblem of Sun and Jupiter combined, which is this very powerful male energy that it's incapable of recognizing its faults as a Jupiterian and solar energy. And then you've got the East, which is Saturnine, which in many ways embraces its faults and calls them just rational, points at the West as being decadent, and frankly they are, because they refuse to acknowledge the dark side of their ruling entity. And but the Saturnine people think they're atheistic. And then you've got Anarchy, and the problem with Anarchy is that it's based on a lie, and the lie is fundamentally that mankind existed in a state of nature and society is an imposition, and the problem with that is it's just factually incorrect. So there was no state of nature, there was no Lockean blank slate, there was no Rousseauian noble savage. Human beings live in society. We have always lived in society. We're a social animal. We will always be a social animal. So there's no such thing as this sort of individualistic anarchy. And of course they fall prey to all of the same Jupiterian problems as well, because they try to include everything, they try to be super tolerant, and they fail to separate the wheat from the chaff, which is Saturn's job. So basically, I guess the point in making this video is that the culture war can be remedied by a synthesis of Jupiter and Saturn in the collective mind of the world. But in order to do that, or able to even start that process, the West has to realize that what the symbol of Jesus is, which is a solar and Jupiter symbol, which has all the problems of Sun and Jupiter as well as the good sides. And the East needs to realize that they are a Saturnine entity, which has all of the negative and positive sides of Saturn. And the anarchists just need to stop being stupid. So that is a brief take on the symbolism behind the culture war. And pretty much everything we see can be summed up into one of those two or three camps: the Jupiterian camp that is self-blind, the Saturnine camp that thinks it's rational, and the anarchistic camp, which thinks that nature is benevolent when nature will kill and eat you and spit you out. So that is basically that. Let me know what you think in the comments.